Hi everybody, this is Byron Jacobs for dmbpoker.com with another hand from an NL100 game. In this particular hand I'm in the hijack seat and the player sitting UTG folds, and I decide to open to 2.25 with the jacks. The guy in the cut-off seat then decides to raise to $8.50, everybody else folds and it's round to me again. Now clearly playing a 100 BB deep here as we are, 3-betting is certainly a possibility. I could 3-bet to around, I don't know, $21, $22, $23, something like that, and see what happens. The slight reluctance I have to do this is that if I do make the 3-bet and then villain either raises again or shoves on me, I really have to fold, I think, because then villain's range would just be far too tight against jacks, and I've wasted quite a good hand. So I slightly prefer the play of calling here and just seeing what comes on the flop. So after I make the call, the flop comes down low with the 5-2-7 with 2 hearts. So now I think the play is fairly standard for the next 2 streets. I decide to check here and villain bets half pot. Now I think calling is really the only play here, and then we get another low card on the turn. I decide to check, villain again bets half pot, and I think with the jacks our hand is way too strong to consider folding here, so I make the call. And on the river we get, for me, what is a very safe card with the 2 pairing off. I check once again, and now villain essentially puts me to the test with a pot-sized bet on the river. Now I think the first thing to do in this situation fairly clearly is to consider the pot odds. Now here I'm going to have to call off slightly less than the size of the pot, so I need to be winning this hand approximately 1/3 of the time in order to make the call with the jacks profitable. It's perhaps slightly less than 1/3 of the time, but you know, for the sake of trying to work out the calculation at the table, we'll call it 1/3 of the time. Now first of all, the first point here is that obviously villain is playing queens, kings and aces in this way, and all those hands are beating me. So if we think about all the combinations of queens, kings and aces that villain can have, there are 18, because obviously there are 6 permutations of each of those pairs. So villain has 18 hands that are winning against me here. Now in order, as I said earlier, to be able to win 1/3 of the time, that means I need to find approximately 9 hands that villain is playing in exactly the same way that are losing to my jacks. Because if that is the case, that would mean that there are a total of 27 hands that villain is playing this way, 18 are beating me, and 9 hands I'm beating. So if I can find 9 losing hands for the villain, then at least I've got a call for value. And obviously villain may possibly have a lot more hands that he's playing this way, and then my call becomes quite profitable. So that's how I like to approach this situation when trying to decide whether to make the call or not. Now the most obvious hand that villain could have that I'm beating is of course ace king, and there are 16 combinations of that, included the suited variety. And it's possible that villain would play his ace king holdings in this way, although obviously checking on either the flop or the turn very much comes into consideration. Villain could also, I think, have 9s and 10s, which it would be perfectly reasonable to play this way, although when you're dropping down to about the 9s, it's possible that villain would be calling pre-flop rather than 3-betting, but it's certainly possible that villain has 9s and 10s in their range for this sequence of plays too. Now that's another 12 hands, with obviously 6 permutations of each of those pairs. So if we add those into the ace king, then we've got 16 plus 12, and that makes 28 holdings that the villain could have. Now clearly villain isn't going to play, you know, every single time with each of those holdings in exactly this way, but it seems to me that, you know, with 28 possible hands, that's way more than the 9 hands that I need to try and identify to make the call. And also, you know, villain sometimes, you know, may have some kind of drawing hand, you know, like the jack 10 of hearts. In fact, he can't have the jack 10 of hearts because I'm blocking that, which is slightly annoying, but he could have a hand, you know, a couple of sort of suited hearts or something that he's decided to play this way. So I think all in all this is a fairly straightforward call, because, you know, like I said, I found enough hands that I'm beating to make the call. I did call, and villain showed up with one of those hands with the ace king. So as usual, let's see what Snowy has to say about all this. First of all, Snowy is obviously totally happy with my initial raise, and the ace king 3-bet is also fine. when it folds and comes all the way back around to me. Snowy actually wants to raise here 100% of the time, although its calling is only very slightly worse. And I find this slightly surprising because I recall another hand that I analysed earlier. In fact, it's one of the earlier hands in this series, where I had a pair of queens in a similar situation, and Snowy was kind of very wary of making the re-raise with the queens, basically suggesting that if I then get shoved on, I'm wasting the hand to a certain extent. So I'm slightly surprised that Snowy is totally in favour of raising here, although, you know, as I mentioned before, the difference between the two plays Snowy regards as marginal. Anyway, so when the flop comes down, the check from me seems to be fairly obvious, and Snowy agrees. And then Snowy doesn't like the bet from the villain on the flop, and I completely agree about this. I think checking here would certainly be the better play. Villain also has a backdoor flush draw with the ace, which is slightly useful, but I think checking here is fairly standard. And the villain can also check here with high pairs as well, so isn't necessarily being unbalanced by only checking with the ace king. And obviously Snowy's happy for me to call the bet, although Snowy actually likes raising here, which I find a little bit surprising, because I think that if I raise, I'm going to narrow the villain's range down, you know, very tightly to basically hands that, you know, the three pairs that are beating me, and I'd rather keep villain's range wide in this situation. So when the 8 comes again, I check, and the villain bets, and Snowy again dislikes this play but doesn't think it's quite as bad as the play on the flop, and obviously very happy with my call here on the turn. And then when the river blanks off, Snowy surprisingly wants to bet here. Now, I'm not quite sure what this is hoping to achieve, because I don't know what I'm going to get called by here, and I think, you know, I'm going to lose against queens, kings and aces whatever happens, assuming that I'm playing bet call. And if I bet here, I think it just gives the villain a chance to fold the bluff part of his range, and also the hands that I'm stronger than, like maybe 9s or 10s. I mean, maybe they're making a call anyway, I don't know. But certainly a hand like ace king, I don't think he's going to call if I shove here. So I'm a bit mystified by that suggestion of Snowy there. And then Snowy doesn't like, again, the villain shove on the river, thinking that you know, villain should check here, you know, 100% of the time. And then my decision to call, Snowy thinks this is a complete no-brainer, and has it as much better than folding here. So I think Snowy is putting, from my perspective, is putting a fairly wide range of hands is being assigned to the player in the cut-off seat here, in order to make this call so completely clear-cut. Okay, so that's our hand. This has been Byron Jacobs for dnbpoker.com. I look forward, as usual, to hearing John Little's opinions.
Hello, this is Jonathan Little. First thing you mentioned here is that you were surprised that Poker Snowy was advocating a 4-bet, and you were comparing it to the pocket queen's hand that we reviewed a while back. And the big difference between this hand and the queen's hand is that in the queen's hand, you were raising the cutoff and then the big blind 3-bets. So in that scenario, the big blind often will be a little bit more inclined to call, and also when he does 3-bet and then 5-bet all in, you're going to be hating it. Also, you're in position, which really makes it nice to call and see what develops. You're going to be able to play well out of position, whereas here where you're jacks, you're often going to, well, if you do call here and the flop comes, let's say, ace 7-4, and your opponent bets, you're just in a miserable spot. Whereas if you get it all in pre-flop, it's not great, you're not loving it, but it's not the end of the world. And I don't think you're 4-betting to fold. I think you're 4-betting to get it in. And this is almost certainly based on the fact that Snowy assumes the opponent is going to be 3-betting stuff like ace-5 suited and then getting it all in. So once he jams, you're probably going to be in a roughly break-even spot, in which case you probably just have to call it off. So that is what's going on with this. The fact that you're out of position is the reason Snowy is trying to just get it all in before the flop so that you can't really make very many post-flop errors. So, and I typically agree with that if your opponents are 3-betting more than just the best hands. And throughout your analysis, you were kind of assuming the opponents were just going to have the best hands, and you're not factoring in any bluffs that your opponent could have. I mean, I would be interested to see what Snowy is suggesting to 3-bet with in this spot, and I imagine it's going to be much wider than you would assume most people are going to be 3-betting, and probably is wider than what most people are going to be 3-betting, but if your opponent does have a decent amount of bluffs in the range, jacks can certainly be felted at this point. So, flop comes, you check, And interestingly enough, Snowy says that leading is not the worst thing ever, which is kind of odd. Notice that the difference in EV is very small. Notice if you do lead, though, it's suggesting this tiny bet. One thing you seem to not be paying attention to too much in the analysis is the actual bet size it's recommending. We'll get to that on the river here in just a second. So you check, and the opponent, as you say, should check. And I think checking here is very nice. Your opponent's going to have a tough time bluffing you off of overpairs, as we saw. And also, he has the ace of hearts, which is going to give him a lot of equity on a lot of turns. He really doesn't want to get check raised as well because he should have a lot of equity against a lot of hands. So I like the check back as you do and Snowy does. Then when you face the bet, Snowy suggests raise. And again, this is kind of similar to the previous hand where we had, I believe, middle pair, where your hand is somewhat vulnerable to the obvious quote-unquote bluffs your opponent has. If your opponent does have many bluffs here, it's going to be ace-king, ace-queen. It's also going to be random low-suited cards, like 8-5 suited or 9-6 suited, stuff like that. And all those hands have some equity, and protecting against those hands probably isn't the worst idea ever. Again, I think this really just boils down to the fact that Snowy assumes the opponent's range is much wider than you're probably assuming it is, and that's going to make getting it all in here mandatory at some point. So now you just have to decide, am I calling to try to induce bluffs, or am I raising to try to protect equity? And I don't think you're really raising this to ever fold it, which, again, feels really dicey to get it all in for 120 big blinds or so. Anyway, you call, and I would have called here as well, the vast majority of the time. But as you play around again with these game theory optimal programs, you're going to see that they really do value protection when the bluffs in your opponent's range have a lot of equity. And here, ace king and ace queen are the most obvious bluffs, and they all have a lot of equity. So it's an interesting spot. On the turn, you check, which I think is good, and your opponent could now bet or check. And again, your call on the turn is very no-brainer at this point, I would think. And you're going to find that very often the programs are going to be suggesting calling on the turn instead of raising on the turn. Because remember, on the flop it was suggesting raise, but now on the turn it's suggesting call. And notice the EV difference is very big. And that's because now the bluffs are drawing to half as much equity as they were on the flop. So that definitely should make you more inclined to call. So you do call. And then the river, Snowy suggests lead. But one thing you did not mention is that, well, two things. Leading and checking are very close to the same EV. So against most people, I think you should be inclined to check if they're going to bluff with stuff like ace-king or random hands like jack-10 of hearts, although you have the heart, so that takes that one away. So that's a reason to check if they're going to bluff a lot. But if they're going to call you with stuff like 9s and 10s, if you lead, but they're going to check behind those if you check, well, then leading becomes pretty reasonable, right? The thing is, though, is that you still lose to the aces, kings, and queens. The big thing you did not mention here is that Snowy's recommending a 0.25 pot bet, which would be about $20 or $18. And I would guess that it's leading 18 here with the intention of folding if you get jammed on. I would think. Although maybe that's wrong. Again, this is where I think a little bit, if you delve a little bit deeper, we'll perhaps learn a little bit more in future videos, because I would love to know if it's leading $18 to fold if it gets jammed on. And I think it probably is. But, I mean, who knows? Maybe it's leading here to call it off. Maybe citing this is near the top of your range, therefore it can't really fold. I mean, the only hands you can have that are better are slow-played aces, kings. Queens, I would think, has to be 4-bet. Kings probably has to be 4-bet before the flop. So maybe slow-played aces. And then 8s, 7s, 5s, if it even has those in the range, which it may not. It may just fold those to the 3-bets. Maybe 5s, 8s, and 7s, it probably sticks around. So, as you can see, it's a pretty interesting spot where these jacks really are near the very top of your range. One thing you'll see if you play around with PO Solver is that it very often recommends a tiny lead on the river when you're out of position with hands that have about 50 to 45% equity against your opponent's range. Now, I don't think that's exactly the situation we are in, but I think the logic is that by leading small, you make it much more difficult for your opponent to bluff. And if you're leading with a balanced range of busted draws and also some nut hands and then just a lot of medium strength hands, like I don't even know where jacks falls in the range, but it's probably slightly better than 50%, but I don't know for sure. You could consider leading small in these spots with the idea that you're going to be calling against some players a lot of the time and folding against other players a lot of the time. But that becomes, whenever you're using that strategy in game, it's going to be a very exploitable strategy, but these programs have figured out how to balance it to some extent. And poker's tough on the river. You'd think it'd be easy. You have some bluffs and you have some value bets, and that's it. But when you start introducing a lot of various sizings, it takes hands out of your, all-in leading range and adds into your 10% pot leading range, and it creates some interesting spots. Anyway, that's why it's probably suggesting leading here. But again, notice it's suggesting a very tiny lead. It's not suggesting that you go all in, because you mentioned that if you do go all in or make a big bet, then yeah, you're only going to get called when you're beat for the most part. But whenever you lead tiny, now all of a sudden maybe your opponent hero calls you with ace high, or maybe decides to bluff raise you, which I don't know if that's what you're trying to accomplish or not. But whenever you do make this bet size, you certainly need to have a plan, and I don't really know what the plan is. But definitely a cool spot. I would have checked as you did, though. And Snowy bets, and like it says, you have a no-brainer call, and I completely agree. This is a no-brainer call. Your hand is quite underrepresented. Your opponent should have a lot of bluffs in his range. I mean, notice the flush draw missed, right? So all the ace-x of hearts your opponent would play in this manner would very likely want to continue bluffing. If he had something like Jack or Queen 10 of hearts, that's going to very likely want to keep bluffing. So there are a lot of bluffs available. You would prefer that you don't have the Jack of hearts in your hand. If you did not have the Jack of hearts in your hand, this would actually be an easier call, because then your opponent can have more busted flushes in his range. But I completely agree with this. Against someone who's playing very well, you just cannot fold a decent overpair, and this hand certainly counts as a decent overpair. And seeing how much equity the Jacks has in this spot, I imagine 10s and 9s are going to be calls as well, which may seem somewhat dicey. And maybe even a hand like ace 8 of hearts or ace 7 if you somehow have that, which you don't. But if you did have those, maybe those are even calls at this point. And, in reality, maybe something like 9-8 is a better call than ace 8, because ace 8 blocks the ace high that may decide to bluff the river. So interesting spot where ace 8 may be a fold, but 9-8 may be a call. So cool hand. Poker's tough, and this is one of these tough spots where I don't even fully understand exactly what Snowy's suggesting to do. But one thing I really did want to point out in this for videos going forward is the small bet size that Snowy recommended, and that's an interesting situation where I don't know anyone who's leading here for $18 when this action goes down, but maybe that's what we're supposed to be doing, and if it is, we should learn how to make it work.